There's a moment when the darkness becomes so thick you can taste it, when the metal walls around you seem to breathe with the weight of 300 souls who never left. Imagine standing in a corridor deep inside the USS Hornet at 3 in the morning, your flashlight beam cutting through the blackness like a knife through flesh, and then you hear it, the scraping, metal on metal, deliberate, methodical. Coming from a room that hasn't been occupied in 50 years, you move toward the sound, because something primal in you needs to know, needs to see, even though every instinct screams to run. The door is open just a crack. You push it wider. Inside, in the medical ward where men bled out on operating tables during World War II, you see a chair empty. You raise your camera, click. The flash explodes white light into the darkness, and when you look at the screen, when you see what the camera captured that your eyes couldn't see, you understand that some places don't just remember death. They hold it. They keep it. They refuse to let it go. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we understand why the USS Hornet CV-12 holds the United States Navy's record for the most suicides of any ship in history, before we explore the passageways where visitors still report being shoved by invisible hands and hearing voices that belong to no one living, we need to understand what this ship endured, what she witnessed, what she absorbed into her steel bones during 16 consecutive months of warfare that would break most men's minds. Because the ghosts that walk these decks aren't just phantoms. They're memories made manifest. They're the price we pay for victory. They're what remains when young men are asked to do the impossible, and some of them never come home, even when their bodies do. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to explore the dark corners of history that textbooks won't touch, hit that subscribe button now. Because what we're about to uncover goes deeper than any documentary you've ever seen. This isn't just history. This is archaeology of the soul. Newport News, Virginia, August 3rd, 1942. The keel of what would become USS Hornet CV-12 was laid down in a shipyard that worked around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the original Hornet CV-8 had just been sunk in the Battle of Santa Cruz. 111 men went down with her, trapped inside a steel coffin, as Japanese destroyers finished what dive bombers had started. The Navy needed a replacement, and they needed it fast. What they built was more than just an aircraft carrier. They built a floating city of death, an 888-foot-long Essex-class warship that would carry over 3,000 men into the most brutal combat operations the Pacific Theater had ever seen. The ship was commissioned on November 29, 1943, and by February 1944, she was already steaming toward the Marshall Islands, carrying enough firepower to level entire cities and enough young men to fill a cemetery. The thing about aircraft carriers that most people don't understand is how inherently lethal they are even in peacetime. These are floating bombs, essentially. You've got aviation fuel stored in massive tanks throughout the ship. You've got ordnance, live ammunition, high explosives sitting in magazines deep in the hull. You've got aircraft with spinning propellers that can decapitate a man in a fraction of a second if he's not paying attention. You've got arresting cables stretched across the flight deck under thousands of pounds of tension that, when they snap, can slice through a human body like it's made of paper, and that's during normal operations. Now add combat. Add Japanese aircraft diving out of the sun with bombs and torpedoes. Add kamikaze pilots who've made peace with death and are aiming their planes directly at your ship. Add 16 straight months of this, sometimes operating within 40 miles of the Japanese home islands, under attack 59 times, and you begin to understand what kind of psychological pressure we're talking about. The crew of the Hornet wasn't just fighting the Japanese, they were fighting exhaustion, fighting the constant knowledge that at any moment, a single bomb in the wrong place could turn their home into a floating crematorium. They were fighting the heat in the engine rooms, where temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where machinist mates worked 4-hour shifts that left them dizzy and sometimes hallucinating from dehydration. They were fighting the claustrophobia of living in compartments with hundreds of other men, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high with barely enough room to roll over. They were fighting the knowledge that if the ship took a torpedo below the waterline, the lower decks would flood in minutes, and anyone trapped down there would drown in complete darkness, clawing at hatches that had been sealed to save the rest of the ship. The Hornet entered combat operations in March 1944, striking Japanese installations in New Guinea, Palau, and Truk. Her aircraft destroyed enemy positions, sank ships, and killed thousands. But warfare is never one-directional. For every Japanese plane destroyed, for every enemy ship sunk, there was a cost. Hornet's pilots flew missions knowing that every takeoff might be their last. That a single mistake, a moment of bad luck, a mechanical failure, and they'd be dead before they could radio for help. Anti-aircraft fire could tear a plane apart in midair. A damaged aircraft trying to land on a carrier deck could crash, explode, kill not just the pilot but everyone on deck, and sometimes planes simply disappeared. They'd fly out on a mission and never return, and no one would ever know what happened. Did they crash into the ocean? Were they shot down? Did the pilot get disoriented and fly until his fuel ran out? The ocean doesn't give up its dead. June 19th, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese fleet made one last desperate attempt to stop the American advance across the Pacific, launching wave after wave of aircraft against the American carrier task force. What happened next would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, one of the most lopsided aerial victories in naval warfare. The Hornet's pilots, along with the other carriers in Task Force 58, shot down 373 Japanese aircraft in a single day. 72 enemy planes fell in one day to Hornet squadrons alone. It was a massacre. The sky was filled with smoke and falling debris, and men burning alive as their aircraft disintegrated around them. American pilots described it as shooting fish in a barrel, as target practice, as almost too easy. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Here's what the survivors didn't talk about at reunions decades later. Every single one of those Japanese aircraft had a pilot. Most had gunners or bombardiers. These weren't machines being destroyed. These were human beings, many of them teenagers, barely older than 18 or 19, who'd been told they were fighting for their emperor, for their homeland, for their families, and they died. They died burning. They died drowning. They died screaming inside cockpits that had become ovens. The American pilots had to watch this. They had to line up their gun sights on another human being and pull the trigger and watch that person die, over and over and over again. 72 times in one day just for Hornet squadrons. And yes, it was war. Yes, it was necessary. Yes, those Japanese pilots would have killed every American in the task force if they'd had the chance. But necessity doesn't erase what it does to your soul when you've killed dozens of people before lunchtime. When you land back on your carrier and climb out of your cockpit and realize your hands are shaking, and you can't remember the last time you felt anything that wasn't adrenaline or terror or a numb detachment that's starting to feel permanent. The Hornet continued operations throughout the Marianas campaign, striking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in preparation for the invasions. Her aircraft flew day and night missions, and the accidents started adding up. A plane would miss the arresting cables on landing and crash into the barrier, killing the pilot instantly. An engine would fail on takeoff, and the aircraft would cartwheel off the edge of the flight deck, plunging into the ocean before rescue boats could reach it. A bomb would hang up on a damaged aircraft and detonate when it hit the deck, killing everyone within 30 feet. These weren't even combat deaths. These were just the cost of operating one of the most complex and dangerous machines humans had ever built, doing it under wartime conditions, with exhausted crews working 18-hour days and expecting perfection every single time because anything less meant death. Deep in the bowels of the ship, in the engineering spaces and fire rooms, men worked in conditions that would violate every labor law imaginable in peacetime. Machinist's mate Dan Brisker, who served aboard Hornet from 1965 to 1969, long after the war ended, told a story that gives you a glimpse into what these spaces were like. One night during the graveyard shift, he was alone in the fire room having a snack when he heard someone working inside a boiler firebox. The distinct sound of metal scraping, the unmistakable noise of someone using a paint scraper on steel. Brisker walked over to investigate, assuming another crew member had come down without him noticing. As he approached, he heard the paint scraper drop to the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the compartment. He poked his head into the firebox. Empty. No one there. Just the paint scraper lying on the deck where it had fallen. Brisker searched the entire compartment. He was alone. He had been alone the entire time. The question he couldn't answer, the question that haunted him for the rest of his life, was simple. If no one else was down there, Who had been working in that firebox? And why did it sound so much like someone who refused to stop, even though their shift had ended decades ago? By early 1945, the Hornet had been in continuous combat operations for nearly a year. The crew was exhausted. Battle fatigue wasn't just common, it was universal. Men stopped being able to sleep even when they had the chance. They'd lie in their bunks, staring at the bulkhead above them, listening to the sounds of the ship, waiting for the general quarters alarm that could come at any moment. The psychological toll of knowing you could die at literally any second, that enemy submarines might put a torpedo into your ship while you slept, that a kamikaze pilot might crash through the flight deck directly above your compartment, it does something to the human mind that can't be undone. Some men started hearing things, voices calling their names when no one was there, footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening and closing by themselves. The more skeptical crew members would dismiss these reports as stress, exhaustion, fear playing tricks. But the reports kept coming, and they kept coming from different people who didn't know each other, describing the same phenomena in the same locations: the medical ward, the forward fire rooms, the berthing compartments in the bow. In June 1945, Task Force 38, including the Hornet, was operating off the coast of Okinawa, supporting what would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Over 77,000 Japanese soldiers died in the fighting, 14,000 Allied troops were killed, and between 42 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians perished, caught between two armies that showed no mercy. The Hornet's aircraft flew missions over the island daily, returning with bullet holes and damage, sometimes with wounded or dead crew members. Kamikaze attacks intensified. The Japanese had realized they couldn't win through conventional tactics, so they'd embraced suicide as a military strategy. Pilots would deliberately crash their explosive-laden aircraft into American ships, accepting certain death in exchange for the chance to kill Americans. It was psychological warfare as much as military strategy. Every man on every American ship knew that at any moment a kamikaze could appear out of nowhere, and there would be nothing they could do except shoot at it and hope they got lucky. On June 5, 1945, everything got worse. Admiral Halsey ordered Task Group 38.1, which included the Hornet, to steam northwest despite weather reports indicating a typhoon was developing in their path. Halsey wanted the carriers in position to launch airstrikes against Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese home island. The weather reports were ignored. By dawn, the task group was sailing directly into the eye wall of Typhoon Connie, the most violent part of the storm, where winds can exceed 150 miles per hour and waves can reach heights of over 50 feet. Imagine being aboard a ship in those conditions. The Hornet displaces 27,000 tons, but in a typhoon she's a toy. The carrier would climb massive waves, her bow rising higher and higher until it seemed like the entire ship was going to flip over backward, and then she'd reach the crest and the bow would plunge down the other side, burying itself in the next wave. Water would cascade across the flight deck, sweeping away anything that wasn't secured. Aircraft chained to the deck would snap their moorings and slide across the steel, crashing into each other, fuel tanks rupturing, fires starting despite the driving rain. At the height of the storm, a wave crashed down on the Hornet's bow with such force that it collapsed 25 feet of the forward flight deck. 25 feet of steel-armored deck, designed to withstand bombs and aircraft crashes, simply folded inward like cardboard under the sheer hydraulic pressure of millions of tons of water. Men below decks heard what sounded like an explosion. The ship shuddered. Alarms started going off. For several terrifying minutes, no one knew what had happened, if they'd been torpedoed, if the ship was sinking. Damage control parties rushed forward and found seawater pouring into compartments that should have been dry. The forward flight deck had been partially caved in. The same thing happened to the USS Bennington, sailing nearby. The heavy cruiser Pittsburgh had her entire bow ripped off by the storm. Only 6 men died during Typhoon Connie, which seems like a miracle until you realize that 76 aircraft were destroyed or lost overboard and 70 more were damaged. Millions of dollars in equipment gone in a few hours. But more importantly, think about what it does to you psychologically when nature itself demonstrates that all your weapons, all your technology, all your military might means absolutely nothing when the ocean decides to remind you that you're just flesh and blood in a tin can, floating on something that could kill you at any moment without even trying. This is where we need to have the conversation that everyone avoids. During her 27 years of service, from 1943 to 1970, the USS Hornet experienced approximately 300 deaths. Some were combat casualties, some were accidents, but a significant number, a number that earned the Hornet the grim distinction of holding the United States Navy's record for the most suicides of any ship, were men who made the deliberate choice to end their own lives. Why? What is it about this particular ship that drove so many men to kill themselves? Was it just bad luck, statistical anomaly, or was there something about the Hornet herself, about what she represented, about what serving aboard her did to people's minds, that made death seem like the only escape? Suicide in the military is complicated. There's the obvious answer: combat trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, the psychological impact of killing other human beings, of watching your friends die, of living in constant fear for months or years at a time. But PTSD doesn't fully explain why the Hornet had so many more suicides than other ships that saw similar combat. Every carrier in the Pacific saw brutal fighting. Every carrier lost men. But the Hornet's suicide rate was exceptional, statistically significant, and that demands explanation. Some researchers have suggested that the ship's history played a role. The fact that she was named after CV-8, which had been sunk with heavy casualties. The fact that the crew knew they were sailing on a replacement for a ship that had died violently. Survivor's guilt by proxy. Others have pointed to the cumulative effect of 16 consecutive months of combat operations without a break. Most ships rotated back to the States for refit and rest after a few months in the war zone. The Hornet didn't. She kept fighting. Her crew kept getting rotated. Fresh replacements coming aboard to replace men who'd been killed or wounded or simply broken by the relentless grind of combat operations. But the ship herself never got a break. And maybe, just maybe, that left a mark. The suicides continued even after the war ended. During the Korean War, during the Vietnam War, during peacetime operations in the 1960s, when the ship was supposedly safe, men still took their own lives aboard the Hornet. They hanged themselves in berthing compartments. They threw themselves off the flight deck into the ocean in the middle of the night. They locked themselves in equipment rooms and used whatever method came to hand. And even after the ship was decommissioned in 1970, even after she was turned into a museum, the deaths didn't stop. People have died by suicide aboard the USS Hornet Museum in the 21st century, in a non-operational ship that's supposed to be a tourist attraction. How do you explain that? How do you rationalize the idea that a physical location, a collection of steel and rivets and old equipment, could somehow carry enough psychic weight, enough accumulated trauma, that people who were never in combat, who never served in the Navy, who just came aboard for a museum visit, would choose to end their lives there? Maybe the answer is simpler and more terrifying than any explanation involving ghosts or supernatural forces. Maybe the Hornet is just a place where death feels close, where the barrier between life and not life is thinner than it should be, where you can walk through a corridor at night and sense, on some primal level that precedes rational thought, that many people have died here, that their final moments happened in these spaces, that their last thoughts, their last fears, their last desperate hopes that someone would save them, all of that soaked into the metal and never left. And for someone who's already struggling, who's already contemplating the decision that can't be undone, being in a place like that might tip the balance, might make the darkness feel just a little bit more welcoming, might make the idea of joining all those other souls who never left seem almost comforting, like you won't be alone. In 1998, the USS Hornet opened to the public as a museum ship in Alameda, California. Since then, she's earned a new reputation. She's no longer just a historic aircraft carrier. She's become known as the most haunted ship in the United States Navy, possibly the most haunted ship in America. If you don't believe in ghosts, if you think paranormal activity is just imagination and suggestion, and people seeing what they want to see, I understand. But I'm going to tell you some stories. And I want you to ask yourself honestly, how many people would have to experience the same thing before you'd at least consider the possibility that something genuinely strange is happening aboard this ship? Visitors frequently report hearing voices, not ambient noise, not the sound of other tourists. Voices, distinct, clear, male voices, having conversations in locations where no one else is present. In the women's bathroom, 2 visitors were washing their hands when they heard 2 men talking loudly enough that they had to speak over them. The voices sounded close, like the men were in the room with them. But when they left the bathroom, there was no men's room next door. There was no place the voices could have been coming from. Months later, they saw a television show about the Hornet's hauntings and watched in shock as paranormal investigators stood in that exact bathroom and discussed reports of men's voices near the sinks. Same location, same phenomenon, different people, no communication between them. In the medical ward, a visitor took a photograph of an empty chair. They checked the viewfinder before taking the shot. Empty chair. They pressed the button. Flash. When they reviewed the photo later that night, the chair wasn't empty. In the photograph, clear as day, was a figure wearing what looked like an old-style pilot's helmet, appearing to be restrained or tied down. The visitor showed the photo to everyone who'd been on the tour with them. They all saw the same thing. A figure that hadn't been visible to the naked eye, but had somehow been captured by the camera. The photograph was taken in the medical operating wing at 4:25 p.m. on July 4, 2006. Broad daylight, not during a ghost hunt, not during a Halloween event, just a regular museum visit. What do you do with that? How do you explain a photograph that shows something that wasn't there? Machinist's Mate. Dan Brisker's story about the paint scraper in the boiler room during his 1965-1969 service is just one of dozens of similar reports from crew members who served aboard the Hornet during her operational years. Men working night shifts would hear footsteps walking toward them when they were alone in compartments. Doors that had been properly secured would be found standing open with no explanation. Tools would go missing and reappear in different locations. Lights would turn on and off by themselves. Electronic equipment would malfunction in ways that made no technical sense. And always, there was the sensation of being watched, of not being alone, even when you knew rationally that you were the only person in that part of the ship. One family toured the ship and videotaped everything. When they reviewed the footage later, they kept noticing a flash of light in the corner of the frame. They assumed it was a camera malfunction, a reflection, something mundane. But when they went through the video frame by frame, they realized it wasn't a flash of light. It was the figure of a sailor wearing a white uniform with a pack of cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve, a style popular during World War II. The figure would appear for a few frames, translucent but clearly visible, and then vanish. It appeared multiple times in different locations throughout their video. They hadn't seen it while filming. Only the camera caught it. And before you suggest it was CGI or digital manipulation, remember that this was in the era before smartphones made video editing accessible to everyone. This was a home video camera, straight recording, no post-production. Just a family documenting their day who came home with evidence of something they couldn't explain. The museum offers overnight stays. Visitors can sleep aboard the Hornet, experiencing what it was like to live on a carrier, albeit without the constant threat of being killed in combat. These overnight events have produced some of the most intense paranormal reports. People wake up in the middle of the night to see figures standing at the foot of their bunks, shadowy shapes that disappear when you turn on a light. Others report being touched, a hand on their shoulder, someone sitting down on the edge of their bunk, feeling the mattress compress under the weight, and then nothing's there. Some visitors report sleep paralysis, that terrifying condition where you wake up but can't move, can't speak, and often hallucinate a malevolent presence in the room with you. Sleep paralysis is a known medical condition with physiological explanations, but it's interesting how many people experience it specifically aboard the Hornet, in berthing compartments where crew members died, and how many of them describe seeing or sensing the same figure. A burned man, a sailor with visible injuries, someone who died violently and seems to be trying to communicate something but can't make himself understood. Girl Scout Norma Harrelson was on an overnight camping trip aboard the Hornet when she encountered something that still terrifies her decades later. She and 2 other scouts saw a figure at the end of a long, dark passageway leading to the forward fire room. She describes him as too horrible to fully detail, wearing a white uniform matted with blood, burned flesh hanging from his bones, eyes bulging in terror. The figure seemed to be beckoning to them. All 3 girls saw it. This wasn't individual hallucination. This wasn't sleep paralysis or dream imagery. 3 separate witnesses describing the same apparition in the same location at the same time. They reported it immediately. Museum staff documented the encounter. It's on record. You can dismiss it if you want. You can come up with explanations, mass hysteria, suggestion, overactive imaginations. But at what point does the weight of similar reports from different people who don't know each other become evidence of something real? Here's the strange, contradictory thing about the USS Hornet. This ship, which holds so much death, which saw so much horror, which continues to be a place where darkness seems to gather like a physical presence, also played a crucial role in humanity's greatest achievement. On July 24, 1969, the Hornet served as the prime recovery ship for Apollo 11, the mission that put the first humans on the moon. President Richard Nixon was aboard the carrier as Navy helicopters recovered Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins from their capsule after splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. Think about that juxtaposition. A ship that had been built to deal death, that had killed thousands of enemy combatants, that had absorbed the trauma of hundreds of her own crew dying aboard her, was now welcoming home 3 men who just expanded the boundaries of human possibility, who'd accomplished something that will be remembered as long as our species exists. The Hornet performed the recovery flawlessly. 4 months later, she did it again, recovering the Apollo 12 crew with the same precision and professionalism. There's a symbolism there that's hard to ignore. Life and death, war and exploration, violence and discovery. The Hornet embodied all of it. She was a weapon of war that became a platform for science and achievement, and maybe that's why the ghosts remain. Maybe what haunts this ship isn't just death and trauma. Maybe it's the question that every person who served aboard her, who died aboard her, had to grapple with. What was it all for? What did their sacrifice achieve? When you're 19 years old, operating a gun turret in the middle of a kamikaze attack, watching planes dive toward your ship, firing until your hands bleed and your ears ring and you can't feel anything anymore except the need to keep firing, because if you stop, someone dies. What gets you through that moment? The abstract idea that you're fighting for freedom, for your country, for the world your children will inherit? Or is it something simpler, something more immediate? The guy standing next to you, your shipmates, the knowledge that if you fail, they die. The Apollo recovery missions were the last time the Hornet did something that everyone could agree was unambiguously good, bringing astronauts home safely, participating in humanity's exploration of space. After that, the ship served a few more years in the Vietnam War, a conflict that tore America apart and left psychological scars that still haven't healed. And then, in 1970, she was decommissioned, mothballed, forgotten. She sat in a shipyard for nearly 20 years, rusting, deteriorating, waiting for someone to decide whether she was worth saving or should be scrapped. In 1998, she was donated to the aircraft carrier Hornet Foundation and opened as a museum. She was saved, but saving her meant preserving everything about her, including whatever darkness had accumulated in her steel bones over decades of service. Here's what I want you to think about. Places have memories, not in a mystical sense, necessarily, but in the way that physical spaces carry the weight of what happened in them. Walk through a hospital and you feel different than when you walk through a church. Walk through a cemetery and you feel different than when you walk through a playground. Our brains are incredibly sophisticated pattern recognition machines. We pick up on subtle environmental cues, sounds, smells, the way light reflects, and we process all of that information unconsciously to form impressions about whether a place is safe or dangerous, welcoming or hostile. Now take a ship where 300 people died over 27 years, where young men, some still teenagers, lived in constant fear of violent death, where the heat in the engine rooms was so intense that men hallucinated, where the sound of general quarters, the alarm that meant you were under attack, became so associated with terror that veterans would experience panic attacks decades later if they heard anything similar, where suicide became so common that it set records that still stand today. Take all of that psychological energy, all that fear and death and trauma, and contain it in a relatively small space, an aircraft carrier being only about 900 feet long, and ask yourself, what would that feel like? What would it do to your nervous system to spend time in a place like that? I don't know if ghosts are real. I don't know if consciousness can survive death or if the dead can communicate with the living, but I know that the USS Hornet is different. I know that thousands of people have reported experiences aboard that ship that they can't explain, that defy rational explanation, that fall into patterns too consistent to dismiss as pure imagination. I know that even skeptics, even people who went aboard specifically to debunk ghost stories, have come away shaken, describing experiences they didn't expect and can't rationalize. And I know that something about that ship makes people uneasy in a way that other museum ships don't. The USS Iowa is a museum, so is the USS Midway, so is the USS Intrepid. None of them have anywhere close to the reputation for paranormal activity that the Hornet has. Why? What makes the Hornet different? Maybe it's the suicides. Maybe death by one's own hand leaves a different kind of mark than death in combat. Maybe despair echoes louder than violence. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the Hornet is just a place where the boundary between what we think of as reality and whatever lies beyond is thinner than normal, where the rules don't quite apply the same way, where if you're paying attention, if you're open to seeing, you might glimpse something that suggests our understanding of life and death and consciousness is incomplete, maybe fundamentally flawed. You could visit the USS Hornet right now. It's open to the public. You could walk through those same corridors where people have seen apparitions, heard voices, felt invisible hands touch them. You could spend the night in one of the berthing compartments, lying in a bunk where hundreds of sailors slept before you, some of whom never woke up. You could stand in the fire room where Dan Brisker heard someone working in an empty boiler. You could visit the medical ward where a camera captured the image of a restrained pilot who wasn't there. Would you do it? Would you walk through those spaces in the middle of the night with just a flashlight, knowing what's been reported there? Would you stay calm if you heard footsteps behind you and turned around to find no one? What would you do if you felt someone touch your shoulder and you were alone? How would you react if you saw, even for a moment, even just in your peripheral vision, a figure that shouldn't be there? That's the real horror, isn't it? Not the possibility that ghosts are real, but the certainty that if you experienced something inexplicable, something that fundamentally challenged your understanding of reality, you'd have to live with that knowledge for the rest of your life. You'd have to carry the weight of knowing that the world is stranger and darker than you'd allowed yourself to believe, and you'd never be able to unsee it, unknow it, go back to the comfortable certainty that death is final, and the dead stay dead, and places are just places with no memory and no malevolence. The USS Hornet CV-12 earned 11 battle stars for her service in World War II. She destroyed 1,410 enemy aircraft. Her air groups sank or damaged over 1.2 million tons of enemy shipping. She helped sink the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. She survived 59 attacks without being seriously damaged. She weathered a typhoon that broke other ships. She recovered astronauts who'd walked on the moon. By any objective measure, she was one of the most successful and important naval vessels in American history. She's a National Historic Landmark. She's a California Historical Landmark. She's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You can visit her and walk on the same deck where World War II pilots took off to fight the most brutal air war in history. You can stand in the same room where President Nixon welcomed home the Apollo 11 crew. But you can also stand in the corridors where 300 men died. You can visit the compartments where despair became so overwhelming that suicide seemed like the only escape. You can walk through spaces where thousands of visitors have reported seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that shouldn't be possible. And you can make up your own mind about what's real and what isn't, about whether places can hold memories the way objects hold heat, about whether the dead ever truly leave or if some part of them remains, trapped in the location where they suffered, trying to communicate something that the living can't quite understand. The USS Hornet is a museum dedicated to honoring the men and women who served aboard her, to preserving the history of naval aviation, to educating visitors about what it took to win World War II and the Cold War and the space race. But it's also something else. It's a monument to what we sacrifice when we wage war. It's a reminder that victory has a cost that goes beyond casualty statistics and dollar figures. It's a place where the past refuses to stay past, where history bleeds through into the present, where you can touch metal that was forged during World War II and feel, if only for a moment, the weight of everything that metal has witnessed, every death, every moment of terror, every act of courage. Every last thought of every sailor who never made it home, even though their bodies did. If this story moved you, if it made you think about death and memory and the price of war in a way you hadn't before, share it. Tell people about it. Keep the memory of these men alive, because that's all we can do for the dead. Remember them. Honor them. Try to understand what they endured. And maybe, just maybe, by doing that, we give their sacrifice meaning. We ensure that 300 deaths aboard a ship over 27 years weren't just statistics. They were individuals. They had families. They had hopes and dreams and fears. They were human beings who gave everything, including sometimes their sanity and their lives, in service to something larger than themselves. They deserve to be remembered, all of them, even the ones who chose to leave, especially the ones who chose to leave, because their choice to end their own lives tells us something profound about what war does to human beings, about the cost we impose on our warriors that we can never fully repay. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever been somewhere that felt genuinely haunted? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? And if you're ever in the Bay Area, if you ever get the chance to visit the USS Hornet, do it. Walk through her corridors. Stand on her flight deck. Pay your respects to the men who served aboard her. And if you hear something strange, if you see something that shouldn't be there, don't run. Stand your ground, bear witness, because maybe that's what the ghosts want. Maybe they just want someone to acknowledge that they were real, that they mattered, that they're still here. And maybe, in a strange way, that's the least we can do for them. Until next time, remember that history isn't just dates and facts and names in textbooks. History is people, real people who lived and suffered and died. And sometimes, if the stories are true, sometimes they never leave. Sometimes they're still there, walking the same corridors, working the same stations, living the same moments over and over again, trapped in places that won't let them go. The USS Hornet is one of those places, and now you know why.